Why? Why are we talking about a tea kettle in biology?
Because we're talking about evolution.
Because we're going to talk about evolution. So I want to remind you of this analogy. If you walked into the kitchen and there's a tea kettle like this, sitting on the stove, whistling its little head off, is it a reasonable explanation to say, is it a true explanation to say, why is that tea kettle whistling? Well, it's whistling because heat's being applied, the water molecules inside are moving faster, some of them are turning into steam, they're escaping here, out that little small opening, then that opening vibrates, and when that opening vibrates, it makes a noise. Is that true? Yeah. And that's a scientific explanation for why the tea kettle's whistling. Is it also a true explanation? Potentially, we don't really know, to say, well, the tea kettle's whistling because half an hour ago, Nick walked in the kitchen, he turned the burner on, he set the tea kettle on it, and then he forgot about it and he left. You know, or he went in the next room, or, you know, he's just now hearing his tea. Sure. When we talk about evolution, we're talking about the scientific explanation. Who turned the tea kettle on is not something we can address here. It's outside the realm of science. We don't have any way to get evidence of who turned the tea kettle on. So if you believe that God created everything and then this was how it went from there, that's fine. If you believe that we were deposited here by aliens or the planet formed out of a magic puff of smoke, or, you know, whatever your perspective on who did it, what we're talking about is how it happened. And I like the Pope. So Pope Francis, the guy in Rome, funny hat, said, in terms of the question of evolution and religion, he said, the church has no qualms with the scientific explanation of the process. We only believe God to be the author of it. So I thought, okay, well, that's a good perspective. You know, we don't know who starts this, but we know how it works. And so what we're going to look at here is the mechanics of how it works. Okay? Wunderbar? Good. Okay, so we're not doing this in the same way we did the last unit, where we're going chapter by chapter. We're covering a number of concepts from 3 chapters, and we're going to talk about it sort of off the book. So we'll use the book as a reference, but we're really putting in material here from 3 different chapters, 13, 14, and 15. Okay, so let's first of all establish what evolution is when we talk about evolution in the biological sense. It's change over time. Anybody know what this is? What these guys are?
Germs.
They're bacteria. And germs is a word we use to refer to a lot of small things, a lot of microorganisms. It doesn't have a real good meaning in a scientific sense, but when we say germs, we typically mean bacteria. We can also mean viruses. We can mean all kinds of things. You know, when we say, I don't want your germs, it's all that stuff. But these specifically are bacteria. And what evolution tells us, now understand, what did the little gnome guy with the beard and the glasses say in the video? That evolution is a lot of stuff. Evolution is the unifying theme for biology. Everything that we understand in biology ties back to these ideas. So it all makes sense in the context of evolution. And what biological evolution says is that this can become this, or this, or this, or this. Bacteria, to blue whales, to sequoia trees, to mushrooms. Those are protozoans. You might find those if you go swimming in a farm pond and you take a sample of water and look at it under a microscope. Does that seem crazy? Does that seem possible? I remember having a student one year go, that can't happen. Well, he was right in one sense. You can't go straight from a bacteria to a blue whale. That doesn't happen. But let's look at some of the intermediate steps. So these are really, really primitive bacteria. These are a lot like probably what the first organisms on Earth looked like. There's nothing fancy there. They don't have any parts in their cells. They're basically like a little bubble with a little tiny loop of DNA in them. That's all they are. There is nothing to them. This is like, instead of a car for your 16th birthday, you get a vehicle that's got 4 wheels and a big crank in the back where you wind up a rubber band. Okay? This is the rubber band car of living things. This is about as simple as it gets. There's nothing to it. All it's able to do is reproduce itself, grow, take in nutrients, and get rid of nutrients, which basically is the baseline definition for living things, right?
Right.
If we think back to the beginning of the year, what did we say? If we're going to call it a living thing, it's got to be able to reproduce itself, take in nutrients, get rid of nutrients, and, grow. They can do that. That's all they can do. There's nothing fancy here. Would you believe that really simple bacteria over many, many generations could become a more complicated bacteria?
Yeah.
That seems reasonable, right? So this bacteria here, this is a spirochetal bacteria. Spiro, like spiral. These things are in these little funny loops. Anybody here know anyone who's ever had Lyme disease? I have. Okay. Okay. It's becoming more common in this part of the country. It's a tick-borne illness, so if you go out in the woods in the fall, deer hunting, or just playing around and being there because it's beautiful, or in the spring is the big season, these little teeny tiny ticks that are like the size of a pencil lead, literally, they're like the size of the tip of that marker, can burrow into your skin, and in their guts, you know how you all have bacteria in your guts? In their guts, they have these guys. They have spirochetal bacteria. And one of those spirochetal bacteria that they can carry causes Lyme disease. So this is a slightly more complicated bacteria. It's got a different shape. It still doesn't do a whole lot more than have a loop of DNA, reproduce itself, take in nutrients, get rid of nutrients. But it's evolved a different shape. So we've got a mutation that crops up, and for some reason, having a corkscrew means your host can't kill you as easily. Okay. Well, what about these guys? Have you all heard of E. coli?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's like,
You find it in poop? I think is what you're trying to say, with vague gestures? Yeah. Well, you find it in your guts, and anything you find in your guts, you eventually find in your poop. That's the way it works.
always, right before lunch.
Sorry. You also find it in cow's guts, and therefore in cow poop. You find it in goose guts and goose poop. All warm-blooded animals have this in their guts. And this is a little bit more complicated. So at some point over millions of years, hold on, somehow a mistake got made, and these guys ended up with some cells that were a little bit elongated. And they've got flagella now, okay? Not cells that were elongated. But they ended up with parts of their cells that were actually elongated and moved. And over many generations, they end up with flagella. They're able to move around.
Thank you.
No problem. So, it's believable to think that a simpler bacteria could give rise to a slightly more complicated bacteria. Okay. Well, let's imagine that more complicated bacteria. Is it reasonable to believe that that more complicated bacteria could give rise to something a little bit more complicated still? Maybe that has more than one cell now? So these are one cell. These are still one-celled organisms. But eventually, they can cluster together. So here we have something that's, well, actually, no, this is still unicellular. But it's got stuff inside the cell that this bacteria doesn't have. At some point, a mistake has been made, an accident has happened, and it was good. Sometimes accidents are good. So that's not unreasonable. Well then, is it unreasonable to think that maybe that slightly more complicated single-celled thing, here's our volvox, could give rise to something that's got more than one cell? So what these volvox are weird. They're not unicellular organisms. They're not multicellular organisms. They're colonial organisms. So each little dot that you see there is its own cell, but they all work together And working together, there are some cells that only do reproduction. There are some cells that only take in nutrients. There are some cells that only get rid of nutrients, and there are some cells that only move it around. That's starting to sound like a multicellular organism. Okay, and they photosynthesize. Did I mention that? They can make their own food. They've got these green things here, which allow them to make their own food. So it's not unreasonable that this could become that over thousands or millions of years, right? Okay. Well, what about this? So here we've got our volvox. They're multicellular. They're not multicellular, but they're colonial. They can photosynthesize. These guys are multicellular. These guys are multicellular. These are actually liverworts. You could find these out at Beaver Creek if you go for a hike down along the creek, living on the rocks. You've probably seen them. So does it seem so unreasonable that this could become that over millions of years? That doesn't seem unreasonable. Or that this is really one of the simplest, earliest plants, this liverwort. There were probably liverworts on Earth when there were dinosaurs. So that's a very primitive plant. How many of you have ever seen these guys? They are horsetails. And I can find a picture of the full plant. They grow down along the creek. They grow in ditches. If you've got a field or a pasture that's got a wet spot, a low spot, very often you'll find these guys growing there. You know, so here we have a very, very simple plant. Here we have slightly more complicated plants. That doesn't seem like such a crazy thing. But yet, when we think that this, that this bacteria could become that tree, that seems insane. But when we walk through it step by step, suddenly we start to see how there's a progression that can happen. So this idea is that, okay? It's called a tree of life. What this looks at is we start off with one really primitive thing. And the first things on Earth were probably they were like what we know as bacteria today. Single-celled, they didn't do a whole lot, they couldn't do a whole lot, they could take in nutrients, they could reproduce, they could grow. That's it. No parties, no hands, no photosynthesis, no nothing. And at some point, a mistake happens, an accident happens, and a couple of them become kind of different from one another. And those keep reproducing, and then we get up to, these other points, and here, two become a little bit different from one another. And two become a little bit different. And they all just branch out. So what I'd like you to do is, you don't have to reproduce all those names, but we're going to draw this together just to get the big idea. So we're going to start off with first organism. Okay. A little split. There's a fork in the road. So we start off with this first organism, and at some point some mistake happens and we end up with things that are different from one another. And one of these branches kind of keeps going, doing the same thing it was doing. And, here something's a little bit different than the thing that was before it. And here something's different than that. And here something's different. And here and here and here and here. And this whole branch, let me see if I can, move this out of the way. This whole branch of the tree over here, this is all the bacteria. So this is, we're going to talk basically about the three domains view. So all bacteria, by this point, very early in Earth history have stepped off the path, and they're different from everything else that's going the other direction. All of our modern bacteria that are in your gut that are good for you, bacteria that will make you sick, MRSA bacteria, methicillin-resistant staphylococcus, that's MRSA. That's what MRSA is. Methicillin, M, is a drug. Resistant is R. Staphylococcus is an S, and then its specific is RS. So it's MRSA. Everything that we call a bacteria on this planet starts from some ancestor back here, and they all have a common ancestor. It's like having a different grandma, having the same grandma. So on this leg of the tree, we'll get this out of the way now. At some point, we have another split. And then something here is different from something here. But they're both at that point still pretty primitive. They're still bacteria-looking things. And then this tree starts to split. And starts to split again. And what we get here are what we call the Archaea bacteria. Okay? And these are really weird things. Things that live in hot springs and at the bottom of the ocean are mostly this group. There are bacteria that live on ice under the polar ice caps. There are bacteria that live on ice crystals high in the atmosphere in clouds. And that's mostly these guys. And there's the bacteria, there's the Archaea. Well, this branch is an interesting one. Fabulous. Because it keeps splitting. So we have things that are a little bit different here. And things that are a little bit different there. And things that are a little bit different there, and there, and there, and there, and there. And eventually, coming off of this line, we get things like fungus and plants. And we get animals. Do animals look like bacteria? Do you look like a bacteria? No. Do I? No. No, we don't. We're very, very different. But we've got ancestors in common. So we've got ancestors in common with these guys that look nothing like us, and these guys, and these guys. And this whole branch of the tree that we're in, these are the eukaryotes. Okay. This whole branch of our tree, those are the eukaryotes. That's us, that's plants, that's fungus, that's protozoans, that's amoeba that can make you sick, that's algae. Oh, I'm going to write these over again. So the big three here, science. This is the three domains. Well, so we have this, whatever that first organism is, however you think it got here, whether you think somebody waved a magic wand, whether you think somebody went, whether you think it came in on a meteor, I don't care. Whatever you think got this first thing there, we keep getting little differences until we've got things that are wildly different. But there are three big groups. So we've got modern bacteria. We've got these Archaea, which are pretty much like bacteria. They're sometimes called Archaea bacteria. And then eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are everything that doesn't look like a bacteria. You're a eukaryote. So is a snake. So is a fish. So is an amoeba. So is an insect. All eukaryotes. So is a fern. So is a daffodil. So is a sequoia tree. So is algae floating on the top of a pond. Pond scum. You and pond scum have something in common. Worms are also eukaryotes. If it doesn't look like a bacteria, it's a eukaryote. So if it does not look like a bacteria, it's in this category. Does it look like a bacteria? There's an easy test. We can make a flow chart for this. Okay? It's a simple one-step test. Does it look like a bacteria? Yes, then it's either a bacteria or an archaea. No, Like, it's not microscopic. It's not one-celled. It's got more than DNA. Then it's a eukaryote. And eukaryotes are the majority of things on the planet. There are a lot of us. And worms and plants and fungus and all those things. They're all eukaryotes. Okay. But how on earth do we go from this to this, or this, or this, or this? And when we said, okay, we can go from, yeah, I believe you can go from that to that. Yeah, I believe you can go from that to that. Okay, that's believable. Sure, I can buy that. I can buy that too. But how do you get all that stuff out of one little thing that looks a lot like a bacteria? Well, right there's the secret. It takes a lot of time. The scale of time is very, very long. I can't possibly do that. That's as good as it's going to get. How old is the Earth? Old enough. Over 21. Legal age for anything you can name, sure. How old's the Earth? 4.5 billion years old. You sound like a man who's heard this before. Yeah. It's 4.5 billion years. Can you even conceive of 4.5 billion years? Because I can't. So, to help us out,